The US Navy did this after the EU sent something massive into the Strait of Hormuz. A narrow strip of water suddenly turned into the most dangerous piece of real estate on the planet, with tankers frozen in place and trading screens flashing red in every major capital. Within hours, satellite images showed what looked like a wound across the Gulf, and the question in every war room was the same. Who is really in control of this choke point, and how far is the United States willing to go to keep it open? Reports claim that while the EU quietly pushed a new naval shield closer to the strait, the US Navy answered with a move that signaled something much bigger than another convoy. It was a warning about what happens when you gamble with the one waterway that keeps the lights on in half the world. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz really is. On a map, it looks almost unimpressive, just a narrow gap between Iran and Oman, a blue pinch connecting the Persian Gulf to the wider world. In reality, it is the single most important oil transit choke point on Earth, a place where roughly a fifth of the world's petroleum liquids flow through every single day, along with huge volumes of liquefied natural gas from Qatar headed toward Europe and Asia. The navigable shipping lanes here are surprisingly tight, with inbound and outbound routes squeezed into corridors that leave very little room for error once a fully loaded supertanker commits. One collision, one mine, or even one credible threat can force captains, insurers, and entire shipping companies to slam on the brakes. When that happens, it is not just a local problem for Gulf states. It's a shock that travels straight into fuel prices, power costs, and the price tag on everything from food to airline tickets thousands of kilometers away. For decades, Iran has studied this geography like a playbook, turning its awkward position on the map into a pressure tool it can reach for whenever it wants leverage. Analysts point out that the shallow waters and complex seabed give Tehran a natural advantage, especially when it leans on asymmetric tactics instead of trying to match Western navies ship for ship. That's where the so-called midget submarines come in. Iran's Ghadir-class mini-subs are small, cramped, and nothing like the giant nuclear boats you see in movies, but they are built for exactly this environment. They can creep into shallow lanes where big submarines would struggle, lie low near the seabed, and quietly deploy naval mines right where tankers are forced to pass. Defense experts say a single Ghadir can lay several mines during a single sortie, and that even the discovery of one mine is enough to shut down shipping while clearance teams move in with extreme caution. Over time, this has given Iran something close to a "do not ignore me" button. One that doesn't require a full war, just enough risk to make the rest of the world nervous about its next fuel bill. So when Europe decided to push more naval muscle toward this pressure point, the stakes were obvious to everyone watching. After Houthi attacks and missile strikes on shipping in the Red Sea and nearby waters, the European Union launched Operation Aspides, a naval mission built around the idea of shielding merchant traffic rather than hunting enemies. Officially, the mandate is purely defensive, focused on providing maritime situational awareness, escorting vulnerable ships, and shooting back only if someone attacks first. Over time, that mission's reach extended beyond the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden toward the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Oman, the wider Persian Gulf, and yes, right up to the approaches of the Strait of Hormuz. French and Italian destroyers, along with a Greek frigate, have carried out hundreds of close protection escorts for merchant vessels, creating what looks on AIS trackers like a thin but determined European shield over some of the world's riskiest waters. On paper, it's about freedom of navigation. In Tehran's view, it looks increasingly like foreign warships creeping closer to Iran's front door. Rumors suggest that inside Western planning rooms, this European move was seen as both a relief and a complication. On one hand, Brussels sending its own ships signaled that Europe finally accepted it couldn't keep relying on someone else's navy to protect the sea lanes that feed its refineries and factories. On the other hand, more flags in a confined tension zone mean more chances for miscalculation. If an EU-escorted tanker was hit, or even seriously threatened near Hormuz, nobody believed the headlines would only blame Brussels. Washington would be dragged to the front of the stage whether it liked it or not. That's why many observers say the EU's defensive mission didn't just change the local balance. It forced the United States to think about what would happen the moment this narrow corridor genuinely seized up. While all this was unfolding, Iran wasn't standing still. Its Ghadir fleet, already a central pillar of its regional naval strategy, had been steadily upgraded with better sensors, more advanced torpedoes, and the ability to fire anti-ship cruise missiles from underwater. These boats are only around 29 meters long, with small crews and limited range, but what they lack in size they make up for in stealth and tactical impact. Maritime analysts note that in the shallow, noisy waters near Hormuz, where the average depth in the Gulf is only around 50 meters, traditional sonar struggles. That creates pockets of acoustic confusion where a small submarine can hide near the seabed, move slowly, and wait. Give that platform the ability to drop a handful of mines directly into mandatory shipping lanes at night, and suddenly a few cheap devices, laid by a barely visible vessel, can trigger weeks of global anxiety. Even if no ship is hit, the rumors alone can force insurers to demand higher premiums and captains to hold position. The EU's Aspides deployments did not enter this environment as a blank slate. They arrived in a region where Iran already had a reputation for using mines, drones, and fast boats to test red lines just short of all-out war. European statements emphasized that their ships were there to protect trade and respond only in self-defense. But local actors read motives in their own way. From Tehran's perspective, it now faced not just American and Allied bases around the Gulf, but a growing European presence stretching from the Red Sea to Hormuz under an EU flag. That's why some analysts say the moment Brussels extended Aspides' mandate and geographical scope, it quietly shifted the mental map of the region. It meant that any real closure of the strait would no longer be a bilateral US-Iran drama. It would risk becoming a full transatlantic crisis. That brings us to the US Navy's move. Publicly, American officials treaded carefully. Energy Secretary Chris Wright told one interviewer that the U.S. Navy was not yet ready to escort tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, but added that such escorts will happen as part of a larger plan to respond to Iranian attacks. He explained that at that moment, most American assets were focused on degrading Iran's offensive capabilities and the industries feeding them, hinting that escort operations would follow once that phase was complete. President Donald Trump, for his part, stated that the United States Navy would begin escorting tankers through Hormuz as soon as possible, framing it as a commitment tied directly to keeping global energy flowing. In other words, Washington was openly telling both markets and Tehran, once our strike phase is done, the next step is to put American hulls between your threats and the world's oil. Behind those cautious statements, though, there was a harder calculation, one that some shipping and security circles discussed in far blunter terms. A widely shared industry commentary put it this way. The most powerful navy in history had effectively admitted it could not safely escort every tanker through a 33-kilometer-wide strait on demand, not because it lacked courage, but because the math was brutal. A carrier strike group is built for blue water power projection, not for creeping at low speed through a mined, shallow corridor where a cheap contact mine can cripple a multi-billion-dollar destroyer. High-end Aegis radars can track hundreds of airborne targets hundreds of kilometers away, but they cannot peel a hidden mine off the seabed 3 meters below the surface. F-35 fighters can strike targets deep inland at supersonic speeds, but they cannot sweep a shipping lane or tow a mine-sweeping sled. The assets were designed for a different kind of fight, and the Strait of Hormuz was exposing that mismatch in real time. This is where the US response after the EU's buildup starts to look less like a single operation and more like a layered strategy. Rather than simply announcing permanent convoys overnight, Washington signaled a two-stage approach. First, hit Iran's offensive network hard enough to reduce the risk of mass attacks. Then, when the most immediate threats are degraded, move into an escort posture for tankers that still need to transit the chokepoint. Reports claim that as more European warships moved under the Aspides umbrella, American planners pushed for a broader coalition presence around Hormuz, drawing in not only EU states, but also regional and Asian partners that rely heavily on Gulf energy. The emerging picture was a kind of moving wall. Carriers and large surface combatants further out in deeper water, Allied ships closer to the lanes, and specialized assets like minesweepers and surveillance drones threading the gap between them. That wall wasn't just built for show. Energy analysts have been blunt about what is at stake when this choke point comes under real pressure. The U.S. Energy Information Administration and other institutions estimate that roughly 20% of global oil consumption passes through Hormuz, along with a large share of LNG exports from Qatar, which alone supplies major portions of Europe's and Asia's gas demand. If shipping there is seriously disrupted, crude prices can spike toward triple-digit territory, with ripple effects across diesel, aviation fuel, and shipping costs. Higher insurance premiums, rerouted voyages around longer routes, and temporary halts can all feed directly into the final price consumers pay. That means a mine late at night near Hormuz doesn't just threaten a steel hull. It threatens the budget of a family trying to fill a tank, a small business paying an electricity bill, or a government already struggling with inflation. In this context, the EU's decision to extend and reinforce Operation Aspides until at least 2026 and then 2027 becomes even more important. Council decisions confirmed that the mission's mandate was prolonged, with millions of euros in annual funding reserved to keep warships on station and close protection escorts available for merchant vessels that ask for them. Command reports bragged that in its first year, Aspides had supported more than 600 merchant ships, with hundreds receiving direct close protection in dangerous stretches. The operation is framed as a contribution to global economic stability and freedom of navigation, language clearly designed to reassure not just European voters but also international markets. But if you read between the lines, you can see something else. Europe effectively admitting that it has tied part of its economic future to a standing naval mission in waters where the US has traditionally carried most of the load. Some observers argue that by stepping into this space, the EU unintentionally forced the United States into a more permanent role than Washington might have preferred. Once European destroyers, frigates, and command structures are visibly engaged in a named operation stretching all the way toward Hormuz, Any major incident there instantly becomes a NATO-adjacent crisis, even if the alliance's flag is not formally flying. In that scenario, the US Navy can't simply stay in the background. It becomes the de facto backbone of a broader shield, providing critical enablers, high-end surveillance, long-range strike capabilities, and the political weight that tells Tehran and other actors that a hit on one ship might trigger a response from several capitals at once. That's why some analysts say the EU's massive deployment into these waters did more than protect tankers. It locked Washington into a long-term guardianship of the strait, whether it wanted that job or not. Of course, none of this changes the harsh reality no admiral can bomb away: geography. The Strait of Hormuz is still only a few dozen kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The Gulf is still shallow, noisy, and cluttered with civilian traffic that makes it harder to distinguish hostile moves from ordinary commerce. As long as so much of the world's oil and gas flows through this bottleneck, every flare-up, misfire, or miscalculation will shake energy markets. Some energy planners push for more pipelines that bypass the strait, alternative export terminals, and diversified supply routes. But those projects take years, cost huge amounts of money, and run into political resistance in every country they cross. So far, they have trimmed the risk at the margins, not erased it. That's why the real lesson from the US Navy's reaction to the EU's move may lie less in any single strike or convoy, and more in the precedent quietly set behind the headlines. By publicly talking about future escorts, by deploying carriers and major assets to the region, and by backing up a European mission that now reaches toward Hormuz, Washington has effectively signaled that any serious threat to this choke point will not be treated as a local problem. It will be met with a multinational shield, funded by taxpayers across continents, justified not as charity for Gulf monarchies, but as self-defense for the global economy. The message to anyone thinking about weaponizing this strip of water is simple. You're no longer just poking one country. You're pulling on a cord tied to fuel pumps, factory lines, and household budgets around the world. So, was the US Navy's response worth it after the EU sent its own shield into the region? That depends on how you define cost. The price tag for carrier deployments, missile batteries, escorts, and extended EU operations runs into the billions over time. But energy analysts warn that a prolonged closure of Hormuz, or even a credible threat that forces months-long disruption, could wipe out trillions in global economic output. That kind of shock shows up as lost jobs, higher food prices, and unstable governments far from the Gulf. From that angle, the combined EU and US naval presence looks less like a sunk cost and more like an insurance premium that nobody enjoys paying but everyone panics without. In the end, what the US Navy did after the EU moved something massive toward the Strait of Hormuz was not just a military maneuver. It was a signal about how the world now plans to treat its most fragile energy artery. It told Iran that its underwater traps and mini-subs will be met not just by one navy, but by a network of them. It reminded Europe that its own energy security is now tied to a standing mission, and to American carriers it does not control. And it quietly warned the rest of us that as long as we depend on this single strip of water, every crisis there will echo in the numbers we see on receipts and bills. The only real question now is not whether the strait will be defended, but how many times the world can afford to find out what happens when someone decides to test